So, benvenuti, signore e signori, and welcome everyone to our next VSR online event. It's an absolute delight to have everyone tuning in from Italy, the UK, and anywhere else in the world that you might be. My name's Emlyn Dodd, and I'm the Assistant Director for Archaeology here at the BSR. And I'm very excited to introduce our first archaeological themed lecture of this academic year. But before I do so, just a few brief reminders, although I'm sure we're all familiar with Zoom webinars now. Firstly, that we do have another online lecture tomorrow as part of our violence and fascism series, so please mark that in your diaries if you haven't yet done so. We also have just a brief warning that tonight's lecture is being recorded. And lastly, any questions that you might have, please do add them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Once Thea has finished, we'll curate and convey these to our speaker following her lecture. So entitled Elite Housing and the Transformation of Rome's Eastern Caelian in the 1st to 4th centuries, our speaker this evening is the wonderful Thea Ravasi from Newcastle University. Thea is a research associate for the ERC-funded Rome Transformed project alongside our other collaborators Ian Haynes and Paolo Liverani. Thea has previously studied at the University of Milan and she received her PhD from the University of Perugia and was also a British School at Rome Fellow in 2018. Thea's past and current research interests include, but I'm not sure limited to, architectural design, archaeology and decoration, as well as Roman housing, bath complexes, imperial properties and the economy. She's worked across many sites, including Tivoli, Pompeii, Herculaneum, Northern Italy, and of course Rome itself, building up an impressive publication record along the way. So without further ado, Thea, I will pass over to you. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Thea Ravasi, and I'll mute myself and stop the video now, Thea.
Thank you, Emlyn. I will start sharing my screen. Let me just find the right one. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah,
I think
that's
you
perfect.
can all hear. Yes, okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Emlyn and our BSR colleagues for giving me the opportunity to talk tonight. I am presenting an ongoing research that is the result of a collective work and that owes a lot to many colleagues who have worked on this, notably our architectural visualizer, Johan Peverett, who developed all the 3D work, David and Denise Heslop, Alex Turner, Steve Kay, and Elena Ponar, who worked on data capture of the sites that I'm going to discuss today, Francesca Carboni, who carried out most of the archival research, and Nicolò Mugnai, a former BSR fellow, for his help on architectural decoration. I also wish to thank Mark Grellert, who designed and initiated SHIDOC, and Mike Simpson, who developed the version that I will show you today. Finally, I wish to thank Paolo Liverani and Ian Haynes, PIs of the SGL2 project and great colleagues of the Rome Transformed project, and Peter Smith, who has generously granted the funding that has made the SGL2 project possible. Needless to say, these are the merits, the eventual mistakes are only mine. So this research feeds into a rich body of studies on the topography and on elite housing of Rome's Caelian. From Collini's 1944 magistral work, Storia e topografia del Celio nell'Antichità, to the works by Carlo Pavolini and Francesco Consalvi, both in 2006 and 2009, on the topography of the Caelian and on the Eastern Caelian precisely. Alongside these works and individual entries on elite properties in the Lexicon Topographicum Urbis Romae are the most specific works that address specific issues, from the archaeology of a property, its phasing or internal decor, to challenges posed by the reconciliation of historic and epigraphic sources and the archaeological evidence, such as Paolo Liverani's seminal works on the topography of elite housing in the Lateran district that provide a careful reassessment of the epigraphic and literary evidence linked to the property ownership in the area. To remain in the Lateran district, Gian Domenico Spilona has recently provided a new interpretation of the elite property under the Lateran Cathedral, while Susanna McFadden has researched on the megalographiae of the Domus Fauste in this area here. There are also researchers and research groups that have worked on currently work on specific areas in the area of the imperial property of the Ortis Paivateris, this area here. I just want to mention the works by Guido Baldi and the body of research produced by Maria Rosaria Barbera first, and now by Anna De Santis and her team in Santa Croce, and notably the work of Donato Colli and Laura Bottiglieri, who I have the pleasure to work with this September. Finally, there are several groups working within the property of the Azienda Ospedaliera San Giovanni Addolorata, which will be the focus of my talk today. Maria Rosaria Barbera and Simona Morretta on the Domus Valeriorum here, Jun Yamada and Alessandra Cerrito in the Christian Oratory, and our research group working on the excavations carried out by Valnea Santa Maria Scrinari in the Ospedale di San Giovanni and in the Ospedale delle Donne here. Finally, I just want to briefly mention a few works on floor and architectural decoration, for example, Fogagnolo's and Cerrito's works on the floor of the properties in the Ospedale di San Giovanni, to give you a sense of the complexity and diversity of approaches to elite housing in the Caelian. We're dealing therefore with a very large body of evidence that has its own challenges, and I'm going to briefly point at them tonight. This talk will introduce you to some preliminary results of a research that was carried out as part of the San Giovanni Laterano II, the SGL2 project, and is now feeding into the Rome Transformed ERC-funded project. The broad aim of this ongoing research on elite housing in the Caelian is to try and understand housing in its wider urban context. Rather than considering the properties as individual entities, we want to assess the buildings, their settings, designs, developments within the context of the wider transformations occurring in the Eastern Caelian during centuries 1 to 8 CE. Tonight, however, I'm going to focus exclusively on the centuries 1 to 4 CE. In order to do so, this talk will introduce you to the context of this research, offering you an introduction to the main archaeologically detectable transformations occurring in the urban fabric of the Caelian during centuries 1 to 4. And it will focus in particular on the case study of the properties excavated by Valnea Santa Maria Scrinari under the Ospedale di San Giovanni, where the research, thanks to the work done as part of the SGL2 project, is at an advanced state and has shown the potential, but also the challenges of an urban approach to the study of elite housing in the district. Some of the results of this work were presented in 2020 at the Ancient Architecture Discussion Group in Oxford. The talk will then discuss how we intend to bring the research forward and engage colleagues working on similar issues in scholarly debate using ArtIShidOC and our 3D modeling work. So in this slide, what you see is the extent to which the Lateran project first and the SGL2 project, the areas that they occupied, and also the buildings that they looked into, and how much the Rome Transformed research has expanded, both in the areas previously comprised in the or nearby the SGL1, the SGL2 and the Lateran project, but also eastward to include a vast district comprising the area of the Ortis Paiveteris, later the Palazzo Sessoriano, the residence, an imperial residence that developed from the Severan to the Constantinian period, the area of Villa Volkonsky, where there is evidence for a series of burials, the burials of Claudius Vitalis here, and the Republican burials of the Via Statilia. The area of the Scala Santa, an area that has not given much information about, much archaeological information really so far, but which is particularly interesting in the way it connects the two main imperial districts of our research area, the Lateran district and the area of Santa Croce, the gardens of Via Carlo Felice. And then two large complexes, monumental complexes that in some ways tie the research together. The Claudian Neronian aqueduct, later the Caelimontian aqueduct that runs across our district, our research area, and the large features of the Aurelian walls. And I'm going to mention these buildings tonight, despite, as I said, focusing mainly on the area of the Ospedale. So when it comes to elite housing and the relationship and the urban approach to elite housing, what is important is to understand the pattern of transformation that takes place in the area and how this connects to the transformations that we see happening in the archaeology of our properties, our domestic and residential properties in the area. Starting from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, we see a series of properties being developed, mainly in the area of the Ospedale di San Giovanni, but also underneath the Lateran Cathedral, and in less, as a smaller extent, in the area of Santa Croce, alongside alongside a series of burials that I mentioned earlier that pre-existed or developed, were set in the area at the same time. We have to remember that this area during the 1st and the 2nd century is still a suburban area. It's outside the pomerium of the city of Rome. It's mainly an area that is occupied by horti-like residences scattered across the landscape, with no obvious, and this is something that comes out from the research that we've done also in the area of the Ospedale di San Giovanni, with no obvious tying and relationship with the urban fabric of the city. How far these residences were connected to the infrastructure, existing infrastructure in the area, for example, the aqueduct, is something we are interested to understand, to get a better understanding of. And I've put here the example of a large nymphaeum, a monumental fountain that was discovered in the area of the Ospedale di San Giovanni Laterano, which was built probably after the construction of the aqueduct as part of a horti-like residence in the area. And just to make a few examples, I wanted you to see the quality and the extent of the evidence we are dealing with. I'm just showing you some examples. This is an elite residence that was built in the area that is now occupied by the Lateran Cathedral. It's being researched by the Lateran Project and also by Gian Domenico Spinola, who has recently published an interesting paper on it in the proceeding of the Lateran Conference, the Lateran Cathedral to 1600s as part of the BSR series. And the area of the Scavi of the Ospedale di San Giovanni Addolorata, which is what I'm going to show you now. The area has been part, as I said earlier, of the SGL2 project, and we have extensively investigated 4 main distinct archaeological areas. 2 areas that are under the Ospedale di San Giovanni, 1 area that is now visible in the open spaces underneath the modern Ospedale di San Giovanni, and then a 4th area which is visible again only underground in the area still part of the Azienda Ospedaliera San Giovanni Addolorata that is now called the Ospedale delle Donne. All these areas were excavated at various times with different methodologies from the sometime before the 1944, which is the date when the excavation of an nymphaeum found in this area was published by Collini. We don't know exactly the time where the excavation was carried out. And then at subsequent times by Ioppolo outside the facade of the Ospedale, but most of the excavations were carried out by Valnea Santa Maria Scrinari, and she published the results of these researches in 3 volumes between 1991 and 1997 that were at the starting point of our research. One of the main problems we have with the Scrinari's excavations is that she didn't carry out excavations with following and using the stratigraphic methodology. So we have a very poor recording of her own works in the area. And even the plans and the maps that she produced are sometimes misleading, not particularly accurate in some instances, and even their positioning is not certain. And so the first work that we deemed essential to do was to scan and 3D scan and carry out a complete 3D scanning of all the evidence visible in the area as it is today, even with the modern restorations, of course, that were carried out after Scrinari's excavations. And then to assess the structural archaeology and attempt a rereading of the stratigraphy, the structural stratigraphy of the evidence available. And this has enabled us to map all these areas to understand their phasing, or more or less, and sometimes it's quite difficult because of the lack of soil stratigraphy, and also to tie these distinct spaces into a whole a whole plan in order to ensure that spaces that are now visible as part of distinct spaces within the fabric of the Ospedale can now be considered and assessed and evaluated as part of a single property. The first one that I'm going to show you is the area of the so-called Domus of the Anni, and I intentionally used the traditional names given by Skrinari in her publication, not because I feel that her attributions to the property of the Anni, for example, are correct, but just to ensure that there's no mistake in the way we define and we identify the spaces within the area. So the area of the Domus of the Anni is indeed can be seen as an underground space underneath the building of the medieval Ospedale di San Giovanni. And here Skrinari, and before her, the archaeologists who excavated an area nearby discovered the remains of an elite domus. An elite domus that in its earliest phase was made of scattered buildings, notably a nymphaeum, a semicircular nymphaeum that can be seen here, that was published by Collini in 1944, and a large property, a large building with a portico, a garden at the center, and a fountain at the center, that Skrinari dated to the 2nd century AD, together with other scattered structures only partially visible today because of the modern restorations and covering of the ancient surfaces after the excavation done by Skrinari, that she interpreted as the remains of an atrium house dating to the 1st century AD. My reevaluation of the whole stratigraphy, thanks to the work done also by David Eslop and Denise Eslop in the area, who did the structural analysis in the area, has allowed to suggest different phasing of the building, both in the area of the nymphaeum that you see here today, but also in the area of the portico that I'm going to show in the next slide. In this slide, what you see is that the extent of the existing scavi. This is a portion of them, the northern portion, where you can see the nymphaeum that is finally linked and joined to the scavi done by Skrinari. So for the first time, we were able to map on one plan all the structures together correctly without mistakes, because we were able to scan all the buildings and all the structures all together. And this orthophoto, vertical orthophoto of the structures, shows you the height of the niche, one of the semicircular niches of the nymphaeum, this niche here, the height compared to the original floor, and it shows you the extent to which the area around the nymphaeum was not excavated and is still is yet to be analyzed and assessed by stratigraphic excavation. The other area that we focused on in our research was the area of the portico, and here by assessing all the stratigraphy together, the stratigraphy of separated excavations, the nymphaeum excavation, the scavi done by Ioppolo, the scavi by Skrinari, we were able to suggest a new phasing and produce new phase maps of the residence. And to focus for our 3D visualizations on the latest Roman phase, the late antique phase, which sees the construction of a large porticoed area with floors and walls covered in opus sectile, and a colonnade all alongside the four side. And also to suggest that in the second phase of this late antique life of the portico, the south and western side of the portico was reshaped with and partially walled up. You can see the structure here, the remains of this partially remaking of the southern portion of the portico, with smaller columns to support the lintel, the original lintel of the portico. The research carried out in the archives, in Skrinari's archives at Palazzo Altemps, done by Francesca Carboni, myself, and Paolo Liverani, has also enabled to find unpublished photos from Skrinari's excavations. And I was really surprised to see among these photos the picture that you see here on the left, that shows a wall in opus reticulatum made of tufa bricks that pre-existed the construction of the opus Vestacium wall that you can see today in its current display, which is this one and this one. And this enabled to show the degree to which the property transformation occurred, and also to provided another insight into the understanding of the phasing of the structure by looking at details and looking at information that Skrinari, in her attempt to attribute the house to the 2nd century family of the family, had overlooked, and to attribute the portico to the 2nd century family of the Anni had overlooked. The work and the overall reassessment of the whole archaeology of the property has also allowed to understand some patterns of transformations that take place and took place in the property. And notably, the fact that the orientation of the property might have changed from the 1st century AD, the time of the construction of the Nymphaeum that you see in the center here, to the 4th century AD when the portico was built, the late antique portico was built. And so we, contrary to what Skrinari originally suggested, that the Nymphaeum originally faced the southeast towards the Lateran Cathedral, we now suggest that the portico and maybe, that's a question, of course, maybe the orientation of the 1st century domus and the horti and access and the entrance point to the domus, to the property, sorry, was from the southwest. And that in the late antique period, in the late antique time, in the early 4th century, the orientation of the domus of the property changed toward the southeast. And this is particularly interesting when we will look at the broadened pattern of transformations that took place in late antiquity in the area. And I will come back to this later. Then we focused on the other nearby space, which was likely part of the same property, but is now distinct by the modern interventions. And by modern, I really mean the post-medieval walls of the Ospedale here. And here, this is the area of the so-called fornaci, the kilns that Skrinari interpreted as a 2nd century AD kilns of Domizia Lucilla, which we revised entirely, and the stratigraphy of which we revised. And so I was able to suggest a new phasing of the whole complex with a phase 1, early imperial phase, with a series of small structures, a service room with opus picatum floors in this area, that were later replaced by the construction of a large body of structures with an apsidal room facing southeast, and a series of other rooms, probably opening on a porticoed area or an open area on the west, and also a series of tabernae opening to the north. And by tying in all this information with the information provided by the Scavi outside the facade of the Ospedale, we now can suggest that all these tabernae opened onto a street that is now running underneath the Corsia Folchi of the Ospedale di San Giovanni. After this phase that dates to the mid-imperial age, probably, we can see a later transformation that takes place probably in late antiquity, given the style of the mosaics that have been found in the area. And so the building that was originally terraced, with a higher terrace here and a lower terrace on this side, was restructured, and the difference, the gap between the higher terrace and the lower terrace was used to create a space, a prefurnium, a service space with staircase leading down to a prefurnium that was used to heat the apsidal room that was now transformed into a heated space. And alongside this, there are also other interventions that can be dated to late antiquity, notably the construction of a staircase that leads to a second floor, to an upper floor that is being developed at this point. And also the raising of the ground floor that we can detect into the tabernae opening. You see that one example here that probably has to do with the rising of the ground floor in the street to the front of the building. And then finally, by again reassessing the stratigraphy, we were able to suggest that during the Middle Ages, the ground floor of the building was raised again, and this time considerably raised. Here you see a cut through of the orthophoto of the scans that we took of the whole area. And the apsidal room became a semi-subterranean space with a very interesting shape that we now need to interpret and the light, of course, of the overall pattern of transformation of the buildings in the whole area of the Ospedale. The third area that we looked at is the area of the Orti of Domizia Lucilla. I'm going to discuss a little bit less on this, but of course, feel free to ask me questions if you want. This is an area that is particularly interesting at the light of the fact that alongside these elite properties, what we see here are the remains of a more commercial and productive center. And so again, here we have reassessed the phasing of the whole building, the whole area. An area that was probably originally used as a residential space with a series of vaulted rooms that acted as a basis villae of a suburban property, and that were later transformed by the addition of a wall in opus testacium into tabernae, and with the addition of a road nearby. This initial residential space was also featured, potentially not in its initial phase, a space for the production of wine, where here a lot of dolia have been found in this courtyard, which is placed on a higher terrace compared to the lower terrace that you see here. A dolia and a larger basin for probably the making of the pressing of grapes, the making of wine, that was connected to this shallow basin that were also connected one to each other at a later stage. And next to it, nearby, there is also a fullonica that was built in a second phase of life of the building at the lower terrace, at the lower level. So I'm going to show you some pictures here. The terrace, the basis villa transformed into a area with tabernae. You can see here the inside of one of these tabernae, and the road surface here in its latest phase. As you see here, from the picture here and from the image that shows how the floor level of the street was raised at some point, similarly to what happens to the north of the area of Corsia Folchi that I showed you earlier on. And here are the fullonica that I showed you earlier on in the map. Then the fourth area is the area of the so-called Domus of Licinius Sura, and this is probably amongst the most complex areas that we have to deal with because of the extent of the excavations and the poor quality of the reports and even of the information provided by the archival from the archives and from the pictures in the archives. The visible area now is much smaller than the one that Skrinari actually excavated. Most of the area where the floor, the opostectile floor that you see here, for example, and mosaic floors, come from, was originally placed to the west of the actual remains of the remains that can be visible, can be seen today. So it's quite difficult really to make sense of the transformations that took place in the area. Nonetheless, we were able to assess at least four main phases, sorry, in the development of the area. One earliest one, mainly residential, but also with some spaces for like service rooms or spaces for not for residents, built for residential purposes. A second phase dated to the Severan period, where a series of water infrastructures, sewers and water channels were put in place, the ones that you see here. And these are well dated thanks to the brick stumps that were found and are still visible in the sewers. A late antique phase with, again, a new raising of the ground floor, similarly to what we see again in the other parts of the complex of the Ospedale. And then a later, very much later phase, which is made by, represented by a large cistern or a large built structure that is cut into the pre-existing archaeology, and that was found filled with skeletons, probably of the late medieval period, that are now not visible anymore. So from what I presented you so far, you can see how much evidence in terms of transformations the whole four areas that I have shown you already can tell us about the transformation that took place in the buildings individually. One issue we have, of course, is to try and understand if these patterns of transformation that we can see and detect in each building or in portions of the buildings are tied together and as part of a overall transformation of the properties following some broader transformations taking place in the area. And in this is important to now understand what are these broad transformations that take place in the area. I started my talk saying and noting how the area was a suburban space characterized by the presence of burials, cemeteries, of a water infrastructure that ran through it, and by residences that were sparsely scattered around the area, but with a big void, with a big gap at the center. During the Severan period, though, between the end of the 2nd and the early 3rd century AD, a huge transformation takes place in the area with the construction of the Castra Nova of the Equites Singulares in the area of the Lateran Cathedral here, of a large bath complex underneath the Lateran Baptistery, and of another large bath complex nearby to the west of it. To the east of the area, the district is also characterized, and the Severan impact is visible in the construction of a horti-like residence, the Hortis Pei Veteres, an imperial property that features some spaces for dynastic display, such as the amphitheater, Castrense Amphitheater, or the Circus Varianus, for example, a large hall, which is today the Basilica of Santa Croce, and some elite residences nearby. Obviously, the construction of a military building, which is not the only one we have in the area, because before that, there was another building built by Trajan, the Castra Priora, that have been located by Lanciani, positioning by Lanciani in this area. And we're trying to understand the extent to which this reconstruction is viable. The impact of this Severan development of the area was massive, not just in the demography, because obviously having maybe more than 2,000 soldiers and their families moving to the area changed significantly the demography of the area. Being Equites Singularis, of course, meant also the horses were there and so on, but also with the presence of the imperial family and of imperial celebrations and public manifestations taking place regularly in the district. How this impacted, how this changed the democracy, how this change in the layout and in the presence of the imperial family in the area impacted on the elite properties and in transformations that we see happening in our buildings is what we want really to try and understand. And I'm showing you here some pictures of the Santa Croce, the hall, the Severan hall later transformed into the Basilica of Santa Croce, the Sekis, and the area of the Domus Acea, where Severan frescoes of pre-existing elite residence were found. Alongside this, along this information that we get from the archaeology, and sometimes quite difficult to date, we do have information that we get from the historical sources, such as, for example, the dating of the buildings that I've just discussed, the construction of the Castra of the Equites Singularis, for example. But we do also have evidence from the historical sources that tell us about changes in property ownership in the area. We have already seen how, for example, in the Lateran area of the Lateran Cathedral, we have a change between from an elite property, which was potentially a private property, into a space that is occupied by an imperial estate, the Castra Nova, and an imperial bath complex, the Castra underneath the Lateran Baptistery. We know also from the sources that the Quintili, who had a house nearby the area of the Hortus of Domitia Lucilla, were killed by Commodus in 182, and their properties were confiscated. The Orti of Domitia Lucilla also likely were incorporated into the imperial patrimonium by Commodus. And so we do see a change in property ownership, and this might have impacted the way these spaces and these areas were used and transformed during the Severan period. Alongside this, of course, what is also interesting to look at is how these spaces, how this property were accessed, and movement and mobility within the area was organized. I've highlighted here at least three main access points. One in the area of the point where the Arcus Celimontani runs near Porta Maggiore, where large inscriptions by Septimius Severo commemorating the restoration of the Arcus Celimontani was located. An area where the Arcus di Basile was originally located. The Arcus di Basile is not visible anymore, but there was another entry point that ran across the aqueduct and entered the district. And the other access point along Via della Ferratella, today's Via dell'Ambaradan, where alongside which the two bath complexes, the Severan bath complexes, were placed, that connected the area to the area of the Baths of Caracalla. Much far away from them. These are entry points, and we do not know much about the other entry points, because at this point, obviously, the area here was more or less free from large buildings. We know it was a raised area, and there was a slope in this area here, but we do not know really much about how mobility worked within this area during the Severan period, apart from the access points. This changes, of course, during the second half of the 3rd century with the construction of the Aurelian walls that mark a sharp change in the way the district is now laid out, and in the way spaces and our elite properties can be accessed and people can move through, with the construction of the long wall that has one and probably two openings on the southern side. And that also marks the change in the layout of the Ortis Veteris, with the destruction of the Circus Varianus and the delimitation, if the word is correct, of the property into a more compact and self-contained, but also greatly more controlled area compared to the previous decades. And then the latest transformation I want to talk to you about, of course, is the Constantinian impact on the district, with the destruction of the Castra Nova that are being replaced by the new Basilica Salvatoris, the Lateran Cathedral, the Lateran Basilica, the destruction of the Imperial the bath complex here, and the transformation of some of its spaces into the Lateran Baptistery, and the development of the area of Santa Croce with the transformation of the Severan Hall into the Basilica of the Holy Cross, which is still visible today. So if you see this pattern of transformation, then you can better understand how the potential of assessing and looking at the transformation taking place in the elite residences nearby, both the area of in the area of the Ospedale and in the area of Santa Croce, their pattern of transformation in relation to the transformations that are taking place broadly in the broader area in the district. So when we want to look at and try and get an understanding of elite housing in the urban context, what we are going to do is to assess most and foremost, and what we've done so far is assess most and foremost the materiality, the evidence we have. And so we want to really assess the role of existing natural and human constraints in property development. We want to understand why certain choices were made at the time of the transformations of the building that we see and we can detect archaeologically. We also want to assess the role of public infrastructures and of their transformations in property development. I've just mentioned the Aurelian walls and the but most of all is the aqueduct that I want to talk about. We see, for example, the opening and closing of some of the arcades of the aqueduct. We need to understand if when this takes place, this opening and with this closing of some of the arcades takes place, and this has anything to do with the patterns of transformation that we see happening in the area and the development of elite properties in the area. And then through a GIS work and GIS mapping of all our evidence, we want to assess the properties' natures and the size and the density and the distribution, and also mobility, accessibility, and intervisibility. And broadly speaking, the questions that I have in mind that I want to bring forward in my research are the following. The first one, how did imperial patronage affect demography and property development in our research area? And what was the nature and extent of the Severan and the Constantinian property development in the area? How can we define the Severan impact in the area? Is it just made of several different distinct activities, or is it part of an overall project that affects the public spaces and imperially owned areas, and also more private spaces or spaces that originally belonged to private owners? Can we detect hierarchies between properties, and what was the impact in the transformation of the urban fabric of the city, of the area? How is it working? Are there areas that are more important in certain moments, and do they see a major development rather than other areas, and so on? And lastly, how distinctive is the Eastern Caelian from other imperial districts of Rome during the Severan and the Constantinian period? So it is important, I think, to address if there is a degree of distinctiveness of this area and the way and the Severan and the Constantinian period the development takes place, and how this affects the relationship with elite residences. We have also several challenges when looking at our data, and some of them emerged while I was talking. And the first challenge that we're facing has to do really with the impact of post-unification, Rome's post-unification development on the historic landscape in the area. And I'm showing here a Knowles plan of Rome that shows the more or less how the area before the unification of Rome, the Rome becoming capital of Italy, the Kingdom of Italy, this area was characterized by the presence of vast areas and vast surfaces left for cultivation. It was unbuilt. If you happen to cross and to walk around the district today, you will see the degree and the extent to which the area has been massively developed during the 19th century, most of the time without leaving too much information behind. Lanciani did a fantastic work in recording as much as he could, and some excavations has been carried out obviously afterwards. And I have to thank Francesca Carboni, my colleague, for the amazing work she's doing on the archives to look into the extent of the information that we get from the archives. Obviously, historic excavations also lack soil stratigraphy. So sometimes we're dealing with very poor information beyond the stratigraphy of the structures. And we are dealing with most of all these isolated spaces and very fragmentary structural evidence. But I try to show you how tying the buildings together, tying all the information together helps our process of interpretation of the phasing as well of the structures. The main issue also we have is that we're dealing with two different bodies of evidence. Now, on one side, we have a body of evidence where we have absolute chronology. We have very good dating from the historical sources, from the epigraphic evidence. And on the other side, we do have evidence from different phasing, but it's quite difficult to then move the understanding of the phasing into absolute chronology and try to understand when these movements, these transformations of the building take place. And lastly, the two other challenges we face is sometimes we don't understand really properly the function of the spaces because they are so fragmentary that beyond saying, yes, this is an elite property or as part of a space that was used for reception, is really well decorated, we don't understand very well how it was used. And also whether the ownership of a building at a given moment was private, was imperial, or both. So these are the challenges we're facing. And so far, our roadmap to an urban approach to elite housing has been to capture data, to evaluate this data, and try as much as we can to interpret this data and to integrate this data. And if you want to know more about the methodology that we apply to this research, we have applied to the SGL2 project and to the Rome Transformed project. Please visit our Rome Transformed research website and look at the methodology pages that will give you some information on it. And then to move on, we use all this information to produce 3D building visualizations and 3D landscape visualizations, both of the natural landscape and of the the urban landscape, humanly built landscape. And these visualizations are presented to are quite useful for us, obviously, because they help our work and help our understanding of the context in which elite housing transformation is taking place, amongst other things. We call these visualizations provocations, and I'm going to show you tell you why in a moment. And we offer these provocations to scholarly debate. The reason why we call these 3D visualizations provocations is because from the given evidence we have, we can produce more than one visualization. So this is the example of the Nymphaeum I showed you earlier in the area of the Domus of the Anni, the so-called Domus of the Anni. And given the evidence we have, our visualizations represent our best interpretation of all the available data in a given moment. They do not represent a definitive answer to our research, but they are rather considered and act as visual prompts for scholarly debate. But also, from the data we have, we can produce and we can create different visualizations. The same data can help us defining or visualize different buildings. And therefore, using the term provocation helps to enhance this, the nature of our visual models, and they role as tools for debate rather than definitive answers to from our research. I'm showing you the Nymphaeum. Now I'm going to show you other examples. Here is the reconstructed provocation, 3D provocation of the Domus in its late antique phase, based on the data available. And you see here, this is the render model, and this one is the more simplified model that shows you the northwestern corner of the portico and the southeastern corner of the portico. And you see here how from the same data, we can come to very different visualizations: a one-story portico, a two-story portico, a portico that has an arcade only on one side, or maybe an arcade on two sides in the south eastern side of the portico. So I hope this makes sense, really, the reason why we adopted this term. Alongside this work, of course, we are also dealing with the issue of how do we contextualize the evidence from architectural decoration that was found during the excavations carried out by Scrinario, generally during the excavations that is found in the area that we feel we suspect might have belonged to the buildings. And here I'm showing you a very famous relief, a relief of the Vestals with the Vestal procession, was found in the fountain as part of the filling of the fountain at the time of the destruction of the fountain. And that can be dated statistically to the 2nd century AD, but was potentially used in the decoration of the late antique domus. And you see here my colleagues Ian Haynes and Francesca Carbone, who are 3D scanning the Vestals relief with an Artec Leo portable scanner. And this will enable us, this is something we've done in September 2021, so it's a very recent thing. We hope that this will, together with the study that will be carried out on the relief with Simona Morretta, which I wish to thank for the opportunity of doing this research, we will try to understand how the Vestals relief was originally displayed and where it was originally displayed. It was, for example, displayed originally on the attic of a 2nd story portico, or if we can think about something else. So in order to explain all the research that underpins our provocations, we decided to adopt a tool that was initially designed by Mark Grellert at Darmstadt University. It's called SHIDOC, and it's a tool, an online tool that provides the interface to respond to the London Charter and 7 principles of digital modeling of historical buildings. So we needed something, a space in which we could make available all the scientific information underpinning all our provocations. And in order to ensure that the tool responded to the needs of our project, and especially to the concept of provocations, we worked with our colleague and based at Newcastle, Mike Simpson, to develop a new version of SHIDOC called Rome Transformed SHIDOC that will ensure that our large and complex data sets, including 3D scanning and the interpretation of the archaeology of the area, are fully integrated in our provocations. But also a tool that will enable us to establish a scholarly debate and scholarly dialogue with those who wish to join us in this discussion on some aspects of our provocations. So here you see an example of how our Rome Transformed SHIDOC works. This is an extract of the page of the website. You can see it. It's available online at the moment. And you can see how from each provocation we can work and upload information related to several variations of the same provocation. Here you see a 1-story portico, a 2-story portico. And for each variations, you will be able to see all the arguments underpinning this particular provocation, the making of these particular provocations. But beyond that, what we wanted to do was, as I said, was to provide scholars with the opportunity to give us feedback on the way we developed our provocations. And so we have, for each variation, we have a comment section where scholars can register and can provide us with feedback on the most various aspects of our provocations, from the type of mosaics, the type of fresco, or the height of the columns, whatever their field of expertise is. We really welcome your insight into our work. And following scholarly feedback, we will decide how and whether to produce a new provocation that we call iteration, that will keep into consideration the information provided by scholars and that underpins the development of a new iteration, so that all the process of the development of a 3D provocation becomes transparent and remains traceable on this website. So what are the next steps for our research, especially when it comes to the area of the Ospedale? As you have seen, the main work now is to work more and more in order to contextualize our spaces. this September in 2021, Salvatore Piro has carried out some GPR work in the area immediately in front of the Ospedale di San Giovanni. And this will hopefully provide some information that will help tying in spaces that are otherwise not connected between each other. So there is a big ongoing work not ongoing, actually it's finished in September 2021, of geophysics in the whole of the Rome Transformed area. Our PhD student Elettra Santucci is also looking at and carrying out a PhD on the hydraulic, carrying out hydraulic analysis of the whole area, just to try to understand how, from the point of view of water infrastructure, all these buildings worked as part of a network rather than as isolated spaces. Colleagues in Florence are working at landscape modeling that will be carried out thanks to with Margherita Zari's team, and will be underpinned by borehole analysis carried out by Carlo Rosa, and environmental analysis carried out by our PhD student Philida Bailey. And then further work on brickwork analysis, because we feel, of course, as I said before, that more work needs to be done in order to ensure that our chronology is not just about phasing, but also we are able to provide information on the exact time frame in which the events and the transformations took place. So I think I've done, I'm finished. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm just happy to answer your questions.
Please join me, everyone, in thanking Thea for what was a fantastic talk on what is, we all know, an incredibly cutting-edge project and something very, very interesting to everyone. Please type any comments or questions into the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen, and we'll be happy to convey those and discuss those with Thea. But while you are all typing and thinking of questions, I thought I might start with one of my own, Thea, and something up maybe a methodological avenue, which you did touch on, but we might dive into a bit deeper. I was wondering, of course, an area so complex in the city of Rome that has experienced so much change over, through antiquity, Middle Ages, and even up to today. How exactly you deal with such a complex area in terms of site formation and taphonomy, particularly with such a heavy emphasis on your project with phasing and trying to identify dates on all these structures. Trying to tease a bit more information and how you deal with kind of this problem.
Yes. So as I think I stressed enough, the problem we have is really in most of our areas, with the exclusion of Santa Croce, where there is ongoing excavations, we lack stratigraphic information, and that's a main problem. We do have structural stratigraphy. So we work and reassess structural stratigraphy, which I'm aware is not enough, and it does not provide the ultimate answer to all our questions, but it's still a good amount, it provides a good amount of information. Then I think what matters really, and what I realized by working in the area of the Ospedale matters a lot, is contextualizing each area within the wider context of the archaeology in the area, because there are some patterns of transformation that seem to be happening not necessarily at the same time, but with the same sequence. Then if we move the same sequences to the same chronology, that's that's the ultimate question of our research at this moment, in the interpretation phase of the research. But for example, I can see in the whole area a raising of the street levels that takes place everywhere, a raising of the ground levels that takes place at certain moments, because I see the evolution of the buildings. How this state happens, does it happen contextually? Obviously, I cannot always have a 100% answer to that, but this is again a very useful exercise. And so my goal, from the point of view of elite housing, but in general, as looking at the structural analysis for the whole of the Rome Transformed area, is really to try to understand as much as I can what's happened in the individual context and the light of what is happening in the wider context. I think that contextualizing stratigraphy is a useful exercise. It's not the ultimate exercise, of course. The other work that we want to carry out is a refined work on brickwork and do brickwork analysis. Obviously, brickwork analysis has its own challenges. From Lulia's work, we have progressed a lot. There's a lot of work done by Bukoyevsky, Maura Medri, by Mirella Serlorenzi on brickwork analysis. There is a big problem in the way we look at brickwork, because obviously we have to take into consideration the function of the buildings, even the structural function of the wall. And so brickwork per se is not the ultimate answer, but again, putting it in context will help tying all the information together.
Amazing, amazing. And I'm continuously impressed with how your whole team deals with the vast quantity of data and manages to make sense of it. We have another question here from Caroline. Were all these excavated areas, as shown in the photos, originally completely filled in and only discovered by removal of material?
So it depends on the area. Of course, I'm just now referring only to the area of the Ospedale di San Giovanni, because obviously that's the area that I showed you. And then there might be differences in area by area across the Rome Transformed region and district. In the area of the Ospedale di San Giovanni, there are differences, whether and where, depending on what was built over the existing Roman structures. In the some areas of the Ospedale, like the Domus of the so-called Domus of Giovanni and the area of the kilns, for example, the structures of the Ospedale, most of the time, but not all the time, were built over the pre-existing structure, reusing the pre-existing structures. Not all the time, but there is quite an interesting pattern of continuity. Not in the use of spaces, but more about using the pre-existing walls to support the new foundations of the new wall. So this means that in some cases we see the remains of the destruction of pre-existing buildings and then a new construction being built above, like in the Corsia Mazzoni, the Domus of Giovanni is a good example. In other cases, we simply see building up and the floor, the thresholds, for example, being built over and over. We are left with the voids because we are dealing with the excavated spaces. And so what we see are the sections sometimes of what has not been excavated. We can address these sections, but it's not always so easy. So it depends. It really varies from area to area. And sometimes we simply don't know because we are left with no stratigraphy.
Mm-hmm. And again, an additional complicating factor when you're dealing with an incredibly complex layered area of the city that has already been excavated, and another site formation practice thrown in your way. Another question here by Mary. Thank you. Throughout, you seem to avoid associating buildings and structures with individual families, for example, the Anni or Domitio Locula. Has your evidence generally failed to support such earlier identifications, which are so tempting for non-archaeologists, but often obstruct analysis and interpretation?
So I'm working on the assumption that unless it's proven archaeologically, I don't want to provide attributes to buildings that are being identified through the literary sources. There's been a lot of research done by Paolo Liverani, who has done some amazing work on the lead pipes and the water pipes bearing names. This, I think, it's very useful because obviously lead pipes lead to properties, and when we bring all this information together, the information provided by the fistulae with the archaeology, and when we understand, for example, the extent of a property at a given time, we can match all this information together. Yes, this is when we can start suggesting attributions. Otherwise, I think it's a very risky exercise. And I think that so far, until we have done a contextual work, we have contextualized our archaeology, we can't really talk about attributions.
Many messages of thanks and congratulations flowing through to Thea for a brilliant talk. Another question from John Herman here. How do you see the change from open garden areas, horti, to urbanized areas with tabernae in your area of study, and particularly in terms of chronology and extent?
So when it comes to the transformation of the horti into more structured buildings, this is a very difficult question to answer to, mostly because the evidence we have is a very scattered evidence. It's a very limited evidence to very small spaces. There is a lot that is unknown. There is a lot of space between the buildings we are assessing that is unknown or is partially known, or we know only from the maps provided by Scrinari, but it's not visible anymore. We cannot assess it anymore. And so that's the first point. So the extent to which we can talk about what spaces, how space was covered, uncovered, open, closed, it's very difficult. And of course, it's in the back of my mind. It's in the back of our mind. It's something we will try to give an answer to. But at the moment, I can't provide an overall answer to that. When it comes to the chronology, what we see is increasingly a pattern of soil occupation. And this, to me, also refers to an increased imperial interest in the area, imperial development in the area, an increase in the demography, in the number of people that live in the area. So I'd love to be able to connect, for example, the construction of the tabernae with the fact that we have more soldiers in the area, like we see, for example, on the Domus, the Casa del Celio, the area of the Clitus Cauri. We see in the Severan period, we have the tabernae. Is it something that is happening in our area? It's still too early for me to say.
We've got time for maybe one or two more questions here, so please feel free to keep typing them in. I thought I might ask while we're here as well, Thea, whether there are comparisons that you see to other, whether Roman cities or across the Mediterranean or even other ancient cities, in terms of this pattern of development of somewhat liminal spaces around walls and just inside walls of cities. Do you see similarities to other sites in terms of what's going on around the Lateran?
That's a very good question. Thank you for pointing that out. Well, I think in general it's very difficult to use Rome as an example. Rome is very much Rome, although of course what we see happening in Rome might have implication to what happens elsewhere, but it's quite distinctive. The other problem we have by comparing what we see and by using an urban approach to elite housing research is that our evidence is really scattered. And so I will try to understand, for example, if we can derive information from better known cities where housing is well preserved, like Ostia, Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the research carried out there, to see whether, on the contrary, we can feed information coming from better known sites into the city of Rome, with a caveat, though, that that Rome is quite a distinctive space. What I think it will be interesting to ultimately to see at the end of this project really is to see the degree of distinctiveness of this region and this district in the relationship between imperial development and elite housing development compared to other areas in Rome, because we have several districts where we have and we witnessed a similar investment during the imperial period, and it will be nice really to see whether the Caelian itself has a meaning and the transformation of the Caelian has a meaning historically or not.
Mm-hmm. And following up from that, something of particular interest to me, the productive areas that you see popping up around this area of the city. I know you've said already it's incredibly difficult to nail down ownership and to figure out who actually owned and operated these facilities. But do you have any kind of grasp or guess even of who was owning and operating these whether they're wine presses or kilns or Forlonica in those periods?
We do have evidence from fistulae from Domitia Lucilla, the mother of Marcus Aurelius, and that in itself is a very good point to and direction to the presence of a production center that is linked to the family of Domizia Lucilia, to then ultimately a family that gives enters the imperial family. And so this is something, of course, that we will address. It's too early to talk, but of course there is further work that we want to do, for example, on the dolia that have been found in the area of the Horti, to do some analysis to see, for example, the fabric, if the fabric is consistent to other dolias that were produced were produced in Rome, where they were produced. So there is still further research. And so, as you see, in many ways, this project can work from a very granular analysis of the smallest details and has to combine really the granular analysis of the evidence and squeeze all the possible information from archival resources, from other types of analysis into a broader urban context. And that's really what I think makes our understanding of the information we have, a reassessment of the information we have, quite potentially valuable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. More messages of thanks and congratulations to Thea on what I agree was a really brilliant talk. So please do join me. We might leave it there and let everyone head off for a rinfresco. Thank you again, Thea.
Thank you.
Please, everyone else, congratulate Thea on what was a brilliant example of multidisciplinary archaeological research. And we hope to see you back at the BSR for our next event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.